Welcome back. I have my medicine. It is a Tiber Peeber, which we like to call a tall boy PBR, a Tiber Peeber. So grab your medicine and sit down with us and take your medicine. My name is Sadie.
My name is Jacob.
And we got another spicy episode coming your way.
This is gonna be an absolutely ridiculous
January
episode.
of 2022 has been the month of ridiculous envelope pushing, I feel like.
Yeah, I think this is the like our timeline is splitting again and you can feel it.
You can, but it's splitting in like a hilarious way.
Yeah.
Because you're like, okay, the ridiculous people are just going to get exponentially more ridiculous until they fall off the timeline completely.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, they are in institutions again. And then the other half is going to go back to some sense of normalcy, I think.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
a bit of a white pill moment.
We had the first timeline split when Donald Trump was elected president.
That was a whirlwind.
And then we've just been in the hellish timeline until this month, and now like everything's splitting again and
everything's crumbling, all the facades.
We're like in the middle of a wormhole directly to the clown universe.
Like, it's just a big old, it's like one of those carnival rides where the opening is a big clown head and the mouth is the tunnel. I feel like those are only in cartoons, but like we're about to enter into the belly of the beast of the clown head.
Yeah.
We're not clown pilled, we're clown digested.
Oh.
Ooh.
So should we talk about the first story?
Yes, and I wish I would have clipped the video because actually it was...
So what does this headline say?
So this headline reads from the New York Post. School district denies litter boxes for students identifying as furries. This was written by Ben Cost on January 26th.
Denies litter box.
Oh, I don't know. Is there a video here we can watch?
Oh, let's see.
Because actually, I really like this this lady.
By a child a couple months ago. That they are put in an environment where there are kids that identify as a furry, a cat or a dog, whatever. And so yesterday I heard that at least one of our schools in our town has in one of the unisex bathrooms, a litter box for the kids that identify as cats. And I am really disturbed by that. And I will do some more investigation on that. I know it's going on nationwide. I know it is. It's part of the agenda that's being pushed. I don't even want to understand it.
I don't even want to
But I think that people need to be aware of it.
She says, I don't even want to understand it. I love how she's like...
Superintendent or principal or whatever is so based. I freaking love her.
You can tell that she's like... She's like kind of apprehensive if she should even be talking about it because she's not even fully sure it's a real thing. She's like, I guess I have to do more investigation and I don't even want to understand it, but
she's almost like laughing at herself, having to even acknowledge that this is happening. Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay. Oh, these controls.
Because I am really upset as a parent that my child is put in an environment like that. And, you know, I'm all for creativity and imagination, but when someone lives in a fantasy world and expects other people to go along with it, I have a problem with that. So I'm just putting that out there. I will investigate more.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I think she basically says, like, that wasn't the full video, but at some point she does say, like, we are not gonna have litter boxes in the bathrooms, basically.
I don't even want to know what the rest of this article says, but
we're gonna though because
we're just gonna go straight.
Oh, I messed that up.
That's all right.
Well, that's basically all that it is. This is a different article. I put them in the wrong.
Okay, well that's fine. Yeah,
but that was basically the whole of it, and then the New York Post basically went on to say, like, you know, this is transphobia and stuff.
Well, yeah, it's like it's part of what we've already talked about a little bit. It's like
it's a load of kitty litter.
You're asking us to accept just patent absurdities.
Yeah.
Like you're just asking us to accept things that are just absolutely unreasonable to accept. You want to be trans? Fine. But when you were talking about, like, should you be in the sports of the opposite sex? Should you be in the bathroom of the opposite sex? You identify as a furry. Okay, you like to dress up in cat costumes and go to a convention with a bunch of other weirdos. Fine. But when you start putting litter boxes in a public in a public school bathroom.
I'm
What
like,
are the other
well,
kids going to be doing?
At least it was in the unisex bathroom, so like that's basically just the bathroom for weirdos, right?
Yeah.
At this point. But
that has to make some people uncomfortable, right?
and it does, and I'm going to tell you why.
Oh boy.
I don't know if you remember when we were in high school. There was this trend of people, they would wear tails.
Yeah, I remember that.
Not like in a creepy way.
Not like
they,
up their butts.
No. They would just loop it on their belts or around like the back belt loop of their pants or whatever. Yeah. And sometimes they were real, sometimes they weren't. I mean, there's a lot of Renaissance fairs and stuff near us, and you can buy foxtails and coyote tails and stuff at those places. So I have one. I didn't wear it to school, but I do have one, and it's not.
Well, some people wear them as like a decoration on their belt too, not like as oh, this is my tail. More of like a look at the beast I conquered.
But the people at our high school would wear it as like it's my tail,
right?
And they would wear like cat ear headbands or whatever. But that was kind of the extent of the furry thing that they did.
They were like half transformed furries.
Yeah, but it was also such a small percentage of the people. It was like 10 people total in the whole school, and they just hung out together all the time.
Yeah.
But there was one person that was like that, and she was in my chemistry class. And she was also in band, which I was in band, and I was never mean to her or anything, but I talked to her in chemistry class because we sat next to each other and I knew her kind of tangentially through band, but I didn't want to address the tail or the ears.
Right.
So I didn't speak to her a lot. And then one day she came in without her tail and her ears. And I was like, this is weird. But of course, announcements were during chemistry class, and the principal came on during announcements and it was like, I just want to remind everybody of our dress code.
Oh.
We're not allowed to wear tails, basically. Like he went through a whole list of things that we're not allowed to wear.
B's.
What was it?
It was
boobs, butts, and
they didn't
bellies?
say boobs. They said breasts.
Did they?
Yeah.
I feel like that's not better.
Breasts, bellies, and they're talking about teenage girls and what they can show. So it's like, it's going to be weird.
Wasn't it busts? Something like that?
Yeah, it was
I thought
the
it was
3Bs.
something, yeah.
It was very sexist because it only applied to women, really.
I did know boys that got in trouble for wearing tank tops that were too cut low or too thin of straps. Or like wore too short of shorts. There were a couple guys that got in trouble for stuff like that. But yeah, so he basically went through like all of the major dress code things, and then at the very end he like tacked on the tail thing, and I was like, oh, you actually got called out for being a weirdo because you were probably making people uncomfortable.
Well, see, that's kind of where the structure needs to come in, right? Like there is a certain amount of like identification that you need to squash down when you're in a position of authority and when you're dealing with minors, right? Like there are some behaviors that just have to be unacceptable, especially when you're supposed to be in a group of your peers, right? Like you have to you can't just let the individuality run wild, especially when you're dealing with people of that age whose brains are still developing. They do crazy stuff. You kind of have to clamp down and like restrict the sort of realm of possibility for these people.
Which is what your job is supposed to be as a principal or a superintendent.
And as a parent.
And as a parent. But, parent, if you're sending your kid off to school 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you might have that rule that like, you're not going to wear a tail when we go to the store. You can have your tail in your room or whatever, but like this is not acceptable. And then, teenagers especially, they're just going to put the tail in the backpack when they get to school, put it on.
Yeah.
So yes, it's the parent's responsibility, but they might already be doing that to some extent, but kids are rebellious.
Well, I don't know.
And so it's still partially the responsibility of, or you would hope that there's some kind of authority figure that is like, this is not healthy. This is not normal. You're at school, which is trying to train you for professional life. There are certain things you can and can't do in professional life. Wearing a tail is not something you can do in professional life, so.
Well, the problem is that I think these people, and this is just going to be a generalization, more just me speaking about what I think is going on, but I think that's probably an issue of parenting more so than anything, because my experience has been people like that, just generally their parents are just sort of distant and absent. Like they just don't care.
Yeah.
Like I knew a kid in one of my classes. He was like a Europunk kid.
Oh,
and
that guy.
He was a really cool guy. I talked to him in German class all the time. He spent like a summer in Germany. He spoke it fluently. Mm-hmm. He was a really cool guy, but he dressed like a Europunk and he didn't try at anything. You could tell that he was a bright guy and that if he had applied himself, he would have been like really good at everything,
Really intelligent,
but he
yeah.
didn't apply. And it's like, you know, and I did talk to him, and he said, yeah, like his parents don't really care what he does. I'm like, wow, because that's like a stark
Yeah.
difference from the way we were raised. Like if I came home with like a B on a test I should have gotten an A on,
Yeah.
you know, maybe not so much in high school, but definitely earlier in my life, I would have got beat. Not really, but
Right. I mean, there were expectations.
Right, there were expectations.
And we each had different expectations.
Right.
Because I was really bad at
But
math.
that's what a parent has to do. A parent has to
But-
look at what they think their child is capable of and structure the expectations to make it so that
well, it's
child's constantly
attainable
getting
goals, right?
yeah.
It's like, okay, I was really bad at math, so getting an A on a test was probably not going to happen, just because I flip numbers around all the time, and I would do the whole process correct, but then the answer would be wrong because I would have flipped like 2 digits in a 3-digit number or something like
yeah.
that. So an A on a test was not really attainable for me. So our parents kind of had to be like, can you try it for like a B minus or like a B? Like, we'll be happy with that because at least you tried. And like, you know, if you put the work in and you study and whatever, but expectations have to be different for every kid. But
Right.
if you also have a parent that has no expectations of you, you're going to end up pooping in a litter box at school.
Exactly. And if you don't have parents that have expectations of you, then I don't see how you would view any other authority as legitimate either. Like if you don't
That's
view
true.
your parents as a legitimate authority, either because they're not trying to be or for whatever reason, maybe abuse or whatever. But if you don't view your parents as a legitimate authority, I don't see how anyone would view any authority as legitimate. I mean, I think
Right.
this is why you see crime rates in broken families that through the roof. It's just like, if you don't have that fundamental respect for authority in the family, how do you have that outside of the
Right.
family? How do you listen to your principal? How do you respect the school? How do you even care about your grades if your parents don't even care about you? You know what I'm saying? Like,
No, I understand what you're saying, but I think the opposite end of the spectrum also ends with, you end up with the same result if you go to the opposite end of the spectrum.
like extreme discipline.
No, not necessarily extreme discipline. I guess opposite end of the spectrum wasn't correct, but instead of having an inattentive parent, you have a parent that is attentive but lets you express yourself however you want.
Oh,
like
yes.
there's nothing off limits at home.
So they're enablers.
I guess the enablers.
They're involved in your life, but they're enabling everything that you do and every decision you
like
make.
I'm imagining a very creative type parent who's like kind of a hippie, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh, well, you know, they wanted to be a cat this year, so we're just gonna let them be a cat and we meow at them and they have a tail. You know, there's parents like this,
Right.
And so if a kid has a parent like that, they're still not going to respect the authority at school because it's like, well, why are you telling me I can't do this? My parents let me do it.
Right.
Call
Yeah,
my parents
that's true.
because what authority do you have over me when this is what I'm allowed to do all the time except at school.
Yes.
So I think there's the inattentive part, but there's also, especially nowadays, like with younger kids actually being openly furries at school,
Right.
which is just bizarre and icky, and I don't like it. But I feel like that's probably more the trend now. It's not so much inattentiveness, but it's more like parents probably feel pressured by social media and all the narratives they're hearing, or they just, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like they want to be a good parent, so they let their kids
Right.
express themselves no matter what it is,
Right.
instead of being like, you need to be a functioning member of society and this is weird and we'll put you on the fringe.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, you know, once again, we have discovered that the appropriate answer is somewhere in the middle gray area. Like this is
Yeah.
not a black and white issue. Like you don't want to be so controlling and have your expectations so rigid that your child can't become who they want to be. But you
Right.
also don't want to just enable whatever whims that they have, because that's going
Right.
to result in an equally
Well,
delinquent child.
There actually is a word for that. It's called authoritative parenting.
Oh, okay.
So and this is actually something well known in child development and psychology, but as we've discussed before, people who are coming up new into the field of psychology are just indoctrinated. They aren't reading the literature that's been around for decades, and they aren't actually studying development. They
Well,
just want to get points.
That makes sense if the literature was written by white men, because that's just illegitimate in my opinion. But go
Oh,
on.
well, then I guess I'll shut up about this point because
I'm
it's illegitimate. But no, they've actually categorized parenting types into like a very broad 4 categories. And there's like authoritative, which is that middle ground where you discipline when necessary, but you still give enough freedom to explore and do whatever. And I believe they were able to categorize this based on how parents interacted with their babies who were just starting to crawl.
Oh, so it's like an innate like parenting style that comes with the parents, basically.
Basically, yeah. But you can correct course.
Right, yeah.
If early enough if you recognize this. But they were studying like new parents and when their babies are starting to crawl.
So before training, they're capturing what is the natural
right.
behavior
They just
of the
wanted
parents.
they just were observing parents. So the authoritative parent was one who was in the room with the toddler or the baby. I don't really know when they start crawling, but and they were just in the room. They didn't tell them they couldn't go in certain places or that they couldn't touch certain things because they'd already safety proofed it to whatever extent was necessary so that the baby doesn't stick its finger in a socket or something like that. And they didn't pick the baby up when they thought it was going to hurt itself, you know, and when the baby wanted to come back for comfort with the parent, they were allowed to do that. And it wasn't coddling. And then as soon as the baby wanted to go explore again, it was like, okay, go ahead and explore. Sorry, flag. And then there was authoritarian parenting, which is like you're walking behind the baby as it's crawling to make sure it doesn't get into anything. It doesn't, which is probably what you do with your cats.
I was just about to say that.
They're cats and they break things. So
yes. And they will eat things that they're not supposed to.
So an authoritarian parent will just follow behind the baby and watch what they do. And if they're about to touch something, they'll grab them, you know, not let them figure it out for themselves. They pick them up and coddle them, for lack of a better word. And then I don't remember the name of the other two. They were very similar in words as well, but it was basically like completely hands-off, two types of completely hands-off parenting, which results in chaos and destruction.
Right.
So, and injury to the baby. So I have that written down somewhere in an old notebook, but yeah. So
it's not unreasonable to assume that parenting style carried out into adolescence and the teenage years can have similar effects, right?
And my professor who taught the child development class that I took, he had been a clinician for 75 years.
He was a clinician? Yeah. So he was 80?
He was old.
No, he was like 90
something. He was
something.
like pushing 90 and he was still teaching.
Wow.
This man, the first day of class, he said, if you're easily offended, get out of my class. Amazing. He gave 2 grades the whole year, the midterm and the final. They were both written papers. And it wasn't like you typed them and turned them in. It was you came into class, sat down, and wrote an essay.
Oh, with pen and paper.
It was hard.
Wow.
I ended up with like over 100% in that class because I loved it.
You had to insert that.
No, but I did because I was really proud of that grade. But he said that the best parenting style after 75 years of clinical work with children and adolescents is the authoritative parenting style, where there's just enough guidance and just enough freedom. And then you get very self-sufficient adults out of that.
Well, I mean, that makes sense, right? Because there is that motif, like there's a reason why the yin and yang is brought up so much. It's like there's always a balance, right? It's like, it's not black and white. It's a little bit of black and a little bit of white and a little bit of white and a little bit, you know.
Exactly.
And so it's like almost everything. Like I'm finding this out. Almost everything is just a matter of balance.
Right.
It's a matter, and Aristotle was onto this too. He was like, you know, virtue is, you know, the exercise of temperance, basically. You know, doing things in moderation. That was the core of one of his major arguments, his philosophical findings, I guess you could say. I would call them findings because I think it's fairly obvious. If you put it into words like there's a balance to everything, then I think that's just that pattern manifests itself everywhere in parenting, in learning a new skill, in anything you could think of. You apply the idea of moderation and you know, some gray zone thinking, I guess you could call it, and your outcomes are going to be better. That's been my experience anyway. It's just, and also, if you use that approach to thinking, right, you apply a balanced approach to critical thinking, you'll find that you're more easily able to see nuance, to think critically, to poke holes in arguments, even arguments that might be favorable to your worldview that you have, right? So, yeah, I just think if you start looking for that motif, if you haven't been, you'll see it everywhere, and it's really helpful to be cognizant of.
Well, and I think you said the $1 million word too, which is nuance. The way our society is structured now, there is no room for nuance. You are not allowed to express nuance. And I am going to put the fault on Twitter for this. Because how are you supposed to express nuance when all you have is 250 characters?
Right.
And
it used to be 140.
Right. And if that is the main town hall for society, right? Like that, or the town square rather, like that was supposed to be the place where everyone could go to exchange information and whatever. But if it's essentially a sound bite, you don't have room for nuance.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful and curate your words very carefully, but most people don't necessarily have the wordsmithing skill to do that,
right,
to encapsulate their nuance in that very small space. And that has become what the internet is. There's just no nuance.
Well, and even if you do carefully write something, even in a 250 character tweet, and you put as much nuance in it as possible, you're still missing the nuance of hearing that person's voice and how they put certain tone onto things. Like, hearing someone might be the difference between them being angry and them just being thoughtful.
Right.
But you lose it. Like, putting words on the internet, that's a lossy form of information. And what lossy means in computers is you're losing some data, usually to lower the file size or whatever. I think it's the same for the internet. Like you gain the quickness of communication, but you lose information. And the information you lose is the type of information that not necessarily verbal information that you get from talking to somebody. Their facial expressions, the tone of their voice is not quite verbal. It's more about the feeling and the vibe, right?
Well, body language has a lot to do with it too.
And I think this is even a problem. Like we have video, and you'll see, I think, Joe Rogan, for instance, gets a lot of flack all of the time. But I don't think people would find him that objectionable if they just watched the clip in context. But people don't do that. Somebody usually transcribes the clip and says, Joe Rogan says on this podcast, and I quote, blah, blah, blah. And the quote doesn't sound that great when it's taken out of the video context. But when you've got Joe's voice coming through the video and he's saying, I don't really know. I'm just a fucking meathead idiot. Like, what do I know?
But the other thing too is that he's a comedian. So sometimes he just says things to be facetious or he makes a joke. But if you don't have the tone and he doesn't say, that's a joke, you're just going to take it at face value because somebody transcribed it, right? It's like sometimes you can tell that he's obviously cracking a joke or poking fun or parodying himself. That was hard to say.
Or even
or
he's
something
just
like that.
Yeah, or he's just exploring.
Working it out.
Yeah, he's just exploring an idea in real time.
And a lot of times he gets corrected by his guests where he's like, well, I always thought this, and you can tell that he's trying to work out an idea, and the person that he's asking or bouncing ideas off of is usually able to say, like, you're on the right track, or actually, no, it's this way. And then he reformulates his question. But if you're just going to listen to like a 15-second clip of a 3-hour podcast, you're going to miss a lot of stuff. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason he does long form conversations. It's because he doesn't want anyone to miss the nuance and the flow of conversation and everything that's said, because a lot of times they'll cover a topic and then by the end of the podcast they end up back at the same topic and they're re-exploring it again. So it's like you miss out on a lot of stuff if you're just trying to clip. Yeah,
so the nuance is, I think the nuance is key, but the internet, it strips out the nuance out of almost everything that you do. And so speaking of Joe, there's this.
The CNN is after Joe again. Are we surprised?
Well, yeah.
And this time they brought their scientists with them.
Oh, boy.
So the headline reads, "The scientists slam Joe Rogan's podcast episode with Jordan Peterson as absurd and dangerous."
Of course they do.
But also, it was a really good podcast. I listened to all of it today.
I love that man, Jordan Peterson.
I love Jordan B. Peterson. He is a godsend, I think, to this world. But the article starts off by saying, as podcaster Joe Rogan faces condemnation from medical scientists, which we know is actually not mostly medical scientists, but for spreading misinformation about vaccines and COVID-19, another interview by the controversial host this week has become the subject of mockery, this time among climate scientists, which are not real people.
Right.
Canadian clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience on Monday, making false and generalized claims that the modeling scientists use to project climate change and its impacts are flawed.
See, we talked about this in the last episode. There they go, predicting and fact-checking the future.
Exactly.
Jordan Peterson has made a claim, which I think is totally accurate, which is that you cannot predict anything even a day in advance with 100% certainty. You might be able to generally, like for the weather, you might have like a really high confidence that it's going to rain tomorrow based on your radar and based on the pattern that you've observed over the decades and centuries, right? That's reasonable. What about a week out? Oh, that's much harder. The weather changes sometimes multiple times the forecast within a week.
Right.
And it usually isn't until the day before that you know what the next day's weather is going to be. Now you take that and go 100 years into the future, and you're telling me that climate scientists know with absolute certainty that the Earth is going to warm by this amount and that the ice caps are going to be this melted. Are you serious? You expect me to believe that? You expect me to believe that?
I know. Well, and I think, and he was also criticizing their models, which I think is a valid criticism, and it's a valid thing to question because it's kind of like, one, where are you getting your data? But two, how are you implementing that data to make your predictions for 100 years in the future? Because it's kind of like weather's so wishy-washy. It's kind of difficult data to track, I would think, because there's a lot of reasons that temperatures can fluctuate and I guess seasons, move or adjust themselves. Like sometimes you have a really long winter and it's really rough, and then other times it's not so bad.
Also, if you're sampling data from all kinds of different locations on the Earth, what happens if some of that data gets corrupted, or maybe you lose a chunk of data for a month because equipment went down or something? Is that going to make a significant impact in a 100-year trajectory if you just miss a chunk of data for a month? Right.
Well, and the other problem is that we've only started recording meteorological data somewhat recently.
In the time scale of human society.
Well, even in the time scale of the Earth.
Well, yeah, like even more so.
There's a lot of climate history on planet Earth that we don't know anything about, and we can never know anything about because we weren't here for many millennia when all of that was happening.
Well, we do know that modern humans lived during an ice age period, and that the Earth has been gradually warming since then, which would make sense if you're coming out of an ice age period, right?
It's going to take a long time for them glaciers to melt. Like, those are thick pieces of ice. But also, we don't know how many times that's happened before because humans weren't around and nobody was recording it. And it's hard to track patterns like that over billions of years. Billions, right?
Well, yeah, billions.
Earth is billions of years old.
At least hundreds of millions.
At least hundreds of millions, but probably more billions. Like there is no way we can go all the way back to the very beginning of planet Earth and track all of the weather patterns.
Well, and I think it's accepted among scientists. This is the part that doesn't understand that doesn't understand me. This is the part that doesn't. No,
it's a racist idea.
No, well, it's probably systemic racism, but. The part that I don't understand about this climate alarmism is that, okay, let's say that I take them at their word and they say the sea levels are going to rise and, X amount of cities, these known cities are going to be underwater. Even if that was the case, we had a period during Earth's geological history where all the continents were merged together in Pangea. And there were barely any ice caps whatsoever.
True.
Everything was hot. There was tons and tons of CO2, tons and tons of oxygen.
But there was also a lot of plants.
Well, that's why you had a ton of plants. That's why you had the gigantism of the land animals like the dinosaurs.
The metafauna.
And also, you had the gigantism of insects and invertebrates, like giant millipedes, mosquitoes. And that was because the CO2 and oxygen levels were so high that the plants it was like a feedback loop. The plants were growing huge because of the CO2, and they were pumping huge amounts of O2 into the air. And that was giving enough oxygen for these bugs to become massive.
Yes, this is the part that really confuses me about, like, climate change activists, they're so worried about carbon levels and planting trees. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. You want to plant more trees, but also cut down carbon?
Well, I think the idea is the trees are carbon capturers.
Well, yes, but if you plant trees and also cut down carbon, the trees aren't going to have anything to eat.
Oh, I see what you're saying, yes.
So you either want to cut carbon or you want to plant more trees. But if you do both, the trees are going to die.
Right. And
because there's not going to be enough carbon for them.
And we have statistics that, for instance, there are more forests now than there were 100 years ago in North America.
Which is great.
How much of that is due to human activity? Probably a good chunk of it.
Yeah,
but how much of that is done because of the rise in carbon in the atmosphere? Like, there's an equilibrium
here. True, like they're
here.
naturally just popping up because there's enough resources for them.
The Earth's atmosphere is a dynamic environment. Mm-hmm. You cannot isolate these things and say, oh, well, just because the carbon level is going up, that means projected into the future. My question for these models is, are they accounting for vegetation?
Right.
Are they accounting for the growth of plants and how plants are going to thrive under a high carbon atmosphere?
Right.
Have they accounted for that in their models? And if so, what is the weighting that they're applying to that? What difference, if you can't tell me what difference the plants are going to make in the overall temperature rise, then your model's insufficient as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's just worried about different species of flora and fauna going extinct, but it's like that is just the way that it goes.
Right.
Humans haven't been around for the entirety of planet Earth, and we aren't going to be for the remainder of Earth. At some point, Homo sapiens sapiens will become extinct. And that'll be the end. And the Earth will live on.
Right.
Yes, we are probably affecting the environment or the climate or whatever you want to say that we're living in, because no living creature can exist without affecting its environment. Right. That's impossible.
Do you think
you cannot be in existence and not have some kind of change on the Earth?
Right. Do you think these environment activists have ever, criticized the beavers for environmental destruction?
Yeah, they're always chomping down trees. What the hell?
And damming rivers.
And damming rivers and changing the direction of the entire fucking water source. And who knows how many fish they're killing by doing that. I mean, seriously. Because if they dam a river and they trap all the fish, some bear is going to come along and be like, oh man, I got a feast now.
Right.
But it's nature's way of like natural population control, basically. Because if a beaver dams a river that has an overpopulation of, let's say, salmon, then a bear's going to come along and eat a lot of that salmon.
Or the salmon are just going to die because of the lack of resources. Like they're
True.
Just gonna die
They'll
out.
either die of lack of resources or they're going to get eaten by predators.
Right.
But either way, those numbers are going to become controlled again. And it's going to be something sustainable for that river.
Right.
And eventually the dam will break and it'll flow again. Because I don't think beavers stay at one spot. I think they like dam it up and then each season they move.
Yeah, I don't know enough about beavers other than their environmental hazards, but
other than them sharp little teeth.
But yeah, this idea that, I think that there's sort of this vibe in the environmentalist movement that any human activity that does any damage to the environment is like somehow a net negative. And it's like, no, it's not a net negative in the same way that beavers damming a river isn't a net negative. Like, we have to do things for ourselves to make sure that we thrive. And you could say from an evolutionary perspective that it's our moral duty to make sure that our species thrives above all else. Now, that doesn't mean that we should just be killing things for the sake of killing things. And we should also be cognizant of our ability to harvest resources into the future. Right? We don't want to fish the oceans bare because then people 100 years from now won't get to have wild caught fish. Right. So like there's a balance but it's a self-interested balance. Any environmental conservation that we should be doing should be so that we can keep our lumber supplies up, our food supplies up, and also have national parks that we can enjoy for recreational purposes. Like that's part of the equation too.
Right.
But this idea that we conserve just because humans are evil and shouldn't be allowed to destroy things is like, that's like a non-starter to me.
Well, and I understand the point that Jordan Peterson is making in this podcast, which we'll play the video in a little bit. But I think for me, what really bothers me is that climate activists or whatever you want to call them, they are trying to take this moral high ground, which we've talked about before, like the virtue signaling moral high ground thing. But I don't want to say I've never cared because I want to respect where I live. I want to respect nature because, like, I don't want to leave trash everywhere. I don't want to leave plastics everywhere because it makes our world ugly.
Yes.
Which we've talked about before, the deficits of being surrounded by ugliness.
Right.
So there's utility to taking care of the place that you live. But personally, I don't really care about climate change or like recycling or anything like that, because every climate activist is doing it for self-preservation and preservation of the human race. Like, the concern is always about humans, right? It's not about the earth per se. It's about how long can we last on this earth, because at some point we're going to have too many people and it won't be sustainable and we'll run out of resources and we'll go extinct. I don't know that I care. I don't know that I care if we go extinct, because we're a violent species. We do create a lot of destruction in our societies. It's not safe being our species. Like, you're always in danger, basically. And the earth is going to reclaim itself once we're gone. Like, us being here doesn't really have an effect on the planet.
Right. Yeah.
Because eventually it's going to recover.
That's more what I'm getting at. Like, I do care that we don't go extinct, but just because I think that, well, what other purpose do you have if you're not motivated by the preservation of your species, you know? And we're using certain adaptive advantages that we have, like our intelligence, to do so. But that intelligence, I think, is being turned inward a little bit, and we are blaming ourselves for things that we're doing to the environment that I think are unfair. I think, you know, saying that, you know, oh, well, these oil spills are terrible and humans are just bad. It's like, well, we need oil to survive.
And accidents happen, right? Like, spills are going to happen.
We need oil to make sure, like, oil was a great boon for humanity.
Yeah.
It unleashed huge economic potential, gave developing nations the fuel that they needed to power their industries and their homes and to get their populations up. So I think that humans need to flourish, just because that's, like, I mean, that's what you do. That's what living creatures do. and the anti-human rhetoric coming from the environmental types about, like, well, we have to have fewer babies because of the environmental impact, and we have to stop eating meat because of the environmental impact, and we have to shrink down our ownership of land for the environmental impact. It's like, that's just totally wrong. That's not a moral good. Restricting the ability of people to live and to thrive and to be comfortable and to own property, that's not a moral good, to restrict that.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, so instead of reading the transcripts that CNN decided to type up,
we got a video.
We have a video of the exact clip that they are criticizing. So let's hear this.
What does this guy say first? So Bad Stats at the Bad Stats says,
I don't know. He's
holy
nobody.
moly, I don't think I can do this. That's such a Reddit phrase. I don't think I can do this. I can't even.
It's also just such a beta thing to say. Like, if Bad Stats is a man, you are not a man.
Yeah, he can't handle two people talking about an issue.
I don't think I can do this.
So beta.
Yeah.
First words out of Peterson's mouth in the Joe Rogan interview are complete self-parody. I can't even dunk on it. Well, that's just because you lack creativity and intellect, my dude. All right, let's go.
Is it self-parody? I didn't get that.
Well, let's see what he says.
Okay.
Hard to sort out. The climate change one is a weird one. So that
well,
one,
that's because there's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay. But your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on a set number of variables.
Yeah.
So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. Well, how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? And that's not just a criticism. That's like, if it's about everything, your models aren't right. Because your models do not and cannot model everything.
What do you mean by everything when you say?
So obviously that's cut off after Joe Rogan asks, what do you mean by everything? But I think that makes sense. If you have to model something, if you're trying to project out into the future, you have to be biased in the variables that you're picking. You
Right.
have to use your study, however you want to rationalize it. You have to pick a set, and maybe it's a large set, of variables that you believe to be the most important to determining outcomes. And we were talking about this just a few minutes ago. Are they accounting for trees and vegetation amount on Earth? Is that one of the variables that they're including in their model? And just because they include it as a variable doesn't even mean that they're right. Doesn't even mean that their modeling is accurate.
That's true. Well, and so I think his criticism is fair because he's saying, well, what are your variables? And why are you picking those ones? You know, and it is a fair criticism because he's right. The climate is everything. There are a ton of things that could be affecting it
Right.
on a microscopic and a macroscopic level.
Right.
How are you supposed to track all of that?
Right.
You can't. You just can't. But we'll go back to the article because it's a little ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that I want to
But-
say about the models too is just really quick too. So, I'm a software engineer, and at the beginning of the coronavirus thing, there was a model that was made open source, which means that the code was viewable, and it was a model, I think, that was predicting some outcome of coronavirus, like how many deaths or how many hospitalizations. And these researchers, to their credit, made the code that generated the model open source. And so I was like, well, okay, I'll go take a look at the source code and just, I'm not going to be able to parse through it all, but I'm just going to take a look. And it was the sloppiest, crappiest code I've almost ever seen.
Ugh.
And so you might have them creating the model that's accurate theoretically, but I don't know how many bugs are in that crappy code that runs the model, and there's no way to verify it either.
Right.
Because if you're using the code to generate the model outcome, how do you know that the code you wrote is even technically sound?
Yeah.
Like,
right.
I would have been interested to see somebody do an audit on that code and see if it was even free of technical bugs. Because a bug like a wrong multiplication or a reassignment of a variable somewhere could throw the entire thing off.
Yeah.
And
right.
so it's like you have not just the model itself being accurate, but is the implementation of the model accurate? That's another question.
Well, because that also adds variables to it, right? Because you already have to pick your set of variables for the physical world.
Right.
But then as soon as you program the code, if there's an error in that adds another set of variables
Right, exactly.
to running the model. So
Exactly.
they're probably pretty inaccurate. If I had to take a gander.
If that one model that I saw open source is anything to go by, I have very low confidence that the vast majority of
I mean, to be fair, the
models are
COVID
accurate.
one was probably thrown together really quickly.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And these climate models, they've been working on them since, say, the 60s, 70s. So maybe they're a little more refined. It'd be interesting to see if they actually have open source code climate models, because then you could evaluate that too and see if it's any good. Maybe there's a bug here or there, but if it's mostly clean code, you might have more confidence in it. But they still have to select the variables that they are modeling for.
Right.
So,
Yeah, there's a lot.
And who's picking that?
There's
You're
a
going
lot.
to have implicit bias in those variables depending on who's the researcher that's picking the variables. And if they're trying to manipulate it to show a specific outcome. Right?
Yeah,
So-
there's so much that has to go right in creating a technically sound model that the default assumption has to be that any model you see is wrong. Like there's so much that has to go right for it to, and then it just like, even if you did everything right, it's still almost a matter of luck whether your model is accurate
right.
or not.
I know. I tend to not trust hypothetical models because, yes, there's data from the past to back it up, but if you're trying to predict the future, I don't buy that it's accurate.
Yeah. I mean, if it was accurate, if it was possible to predict the future, I mean, this is the example a lot of people use, the stock market. If you could make an accurate model that was
Right.
even accurate to what the stock prices are going to be tomorrow,
Well,
you would make so much money.
You know who has a very good model of the stock market?
Who's that?
Nancy Pelosi.
Oh, she does.
She always gets it right.
I wonder if she's going to open source her
She
stock
really
market
should,
code.
because people who follow her model tend to do very well in the stock market.
Yeah.
So I don't know. She must be very good at code for being in her 80s. Props to her, because I don't understand code at all.
Yeah, she must have a crystal ball in her dungeon or something.
Oh, on her staff probably.
In her witch's coven.
She keeps it in her witchy hat. So this first paragraph, or these first couple of paragraphs, basically just transcribe what Jordan Peterson said, but of course they have to get their little snipes in there or whatever.
Right.
So they call it waffling remarks. There's no such thing as climate, right? But yeah, and then, he says he then went on to mock, quote, climate types who he said typically suggest that, quote, climate is about everything. He didn't say that those climate types suggest that. He made the assertion that climate is everything.
Right.
So we already have some tricky finagling happening, right? And then he is quoted again as saying, but your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on a set number of variables, which we talked about. So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. But how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? Which is a very fair question.
Right. And
you should have to give some kind of proof of reasoning, right? Like, we chose these variables for X reasons, and we'll see what the model runs at, and then we'll develop another model that runs at a different set of variables and see how they compare. I think that would be fair.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think, maybe we're just too red-pilled, but that, so the first one, obviously, they have to state, the thing about this fake news stuff is that they might be technically accurate. So far, this article is technically accurate, but they use words like waffling, which has a very negative connotation.
Yes.
It's
and
not,
mock.
It's not, Peterson was like trying to collect his words and speak carefully. You could say that's a positive connotation. Instead, they use waffling. I think both descriptions could be accurate depending on your perspective, but
I don't think he was doing either of those things, though. It seemed like he knew exactly what he wanted to say because he's thought about this topic.
Yeah, that's true.
But, maybe he stutters, but I think that's just because he has a stutter.
Right.
I don't think that's him waffling. I think that's just a speech impediment.
Well, I don't know if he has a speech impediment, but you typically see that with intellectual types when they're trying to get their thoughts together and they're thinking too fast, they'll stutter.
Yes, that's true.
I call it the intellectual stutter. They just go, I think, there's something here that, they just like.
Depending on the person, it really bothers me. But for whatever reason, Jordan Peterson's doesn't bother me.
Well, you can do it on occasion, but there's some intellectuals, and we've all seen them, where every single sentence has to start with I.
Are you adding Sam Harris right now?
Oh, yeah.
That man irritates me.
I think it's an attempt to make themselves sound smart, like they're struggling to get the words out because their thoughts are just so...
They're thinking so fast they can't get their words out.
Yeah,
how about you just take a breath?
Yeah, just shut the hell up and think about what you're saying.
Just take a pause.
But, so this second paragraph, which is what he said in the video...
Yes.
I don't see how any reasonable person that's actually interested in critical thinking would find this statement unreasonable.
Well, and actually, I think they do him a service by transcribing it, because you're probably not going to watch the video if you're not a fan of Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan.
True.
So you're already not going to click that link to watch the video. So they kind of do him a service by putting the second paragraph in quotes, because it is reasonable, and without the tone, it just seems like a question you would ask when formulating a hypothesis. Isn't it? Doesn't it sound like that? So they kind of actually
That's a reasonable...
favored him in that.
As far as I'm concerned, this statement is not illogical or unreasonable at all. He's saying in order to make a model, you have to pick a finite set of variables.
Right.
And then he goes on to say, how do you decide which set of variables are the most important? How do you decide that? Now, maybe that's a question that can be answered, but these people who are climate scientists, they never seem eager to come out to the public and explain proper breakdown, do a 4-hour podcast. Here's everything, how we decided variables, and you have a question about why we picked this one. Well, here's why we considered this one over that one. You don't see anybody doing any of that. They just say from the top down, we've decided this, and if you don't accept it, you're a climate denier. They don't even make an attempt to answer any of these thoughtful questions. And
climate denier is the funniest expression too, because it's like, are you denying reality?
Right.
Like, what? I don't understand. But so it goes on to say, Peterson's remarks show a general misunderstanding of how scientific modeling works. I didn't get that at all from the previous statements.
That's just a statement that means nothing.
Apparently. Scientists use models or simulations to project particular aspects of climate change, such as the rise in global temperatures, changes in rainfall patterns, and the likelihood of drought. Okay, so those are your variables. that you're using in your models, supposedly, right?
Right, but they also don't describe how he's misunderstanding it.
Exactly.
Because if you ran that statement by Jordan Peterson, he'd be like, yeah, and?
Exactly.
Like, that's what he...
Exactly.
Like, that's not a criticism.
No.
That's not a criticism.
He has a general misunderstanding that they use simulations to see what could happen, but it still doesn't answer the question of what are the variable sets that you're using.
And what exactly is he misunderstanding? He obviously knows what a model is. He obviously knows that variables
They
go into a
know
model.
that he is a psychologist, right? And has performed his own studies in his clinical practice
And
and
he's one of the
probably
most
has
cited.
used models.
He's one of the most cited psychologists
That's true.
ever.
Yes. Yeah. And I think one of the most published
Yes.
also.
Yeah.
So anyway, it goes on. Climate scientists are now ridiculing Peterson's claims, but as far as I'm concerned, climate scientists are like bottom tier scientists.
Yeah.
Quote, such seemingly comic nihilism would be funny if it weren't so dangerous. Michael E. Mann, a climate scientist at Pennsylvania State University, told CNN.
This is what I was just talking about. This is why these people are not trustworthy, because they're ready to just dunk and insult. They won't even try to address the criticisms. He's not even trying. He's just saying, oh, it's comic nihilism that is just dangerous. Explain it to us. Explain the fucking science if you're so fucking smart. Fucking explain it, you goddamn piece of shit. Holy crap. I'm so frustrated with these people. They're fucking know-it-alls that think we're all fucking retards that can't dissect critically. Oh, I'm just so...
Well, they're like, actually, that's just nihilism.
It's like...
Which is a hilarious thing if you know anything about Jordan Peterson. He is the farthest thing from being a nihilist.
Right.
And also, how is questioning a model of a prediction nihilism? Do you know what that word means? Do you know what that means? Because I'm pretty sure a nihilist would not worry themselves about climate change models.
Right.
They wouldn't care enough to worry about what's happening with the climate. That is like the definition of nihilism. They'd actually probably go out of their way to destroy the climate because they're a nihilist.
Right.
You can't even ask logical questions anymore without being dismissed completely out of hand.
You have a legitimate, honest question about how are the models accurate how are you picking the right variables? That's the question. That's the question. How are you picking the right variables? And Michael E. Mann says, you're a nihilistic comic book character or fucking whatever, and you're dangerous. How about you use your brainy big smarts to explain to us plebeians how the climate science works? I noticed that you're not even making an attempt to do that, sir.
Jordan Peterson hit him in his feels, apparently. Because how is that your first reaction? And if CNN reaches out to you for a comment, why is your first reaction not to be like, oh, he wants to know what the variables are. Here they are. This is why we chose them. Or at least my lab chose these ones for this reason. Other labs might have different models where they pick other variables for different reasons, but this is our justification. This is our study that we're doing. This is our abstract. Here you go. Instead, he takes it personally and has to make it a personal attack on Peterson's character instead of just taking the statement at face value and answering the question.
Right.
Because Jordan Peterson does not ever claim to be a climate scientist. He doesn't say that he knows anything about it. He literally just wants to know, what are your models based on?
Right.
Which is a very reasonable question that any person can ask.
And here,
well, apparently you can't ask it,
if someone like Michael E. Mann was actually a respectable, thoughtful person, what he would do is he would say, oh, I understand Jordan Peterson's claims. This is something that we have to deal with, or this is something that we've considered. Here's our rationale for picking all the variables. And this guy, furthermore, would reach out to Joe Rogan and say, hey, I'm a climate scientist with such and such. Jordan Peterson recently raised valid questions about how we do our modeling process. I'd love to come on your show with charts and data and explain to you how we've broken everything down.
But now that he's said this, he's never going to be on the Joe Rogan Experience because Joe Rogan's going to be like, fuck you.
Right.
Because you're not going to add anything valid or valuable to the conversation.
Right.
You're just you're just going to devalue everything.
And this is just so obvious, right? If you want to educate people, you cannot be a sniping, sniveling piece of shit. That's not how you win people over. And this is kind of like my tell for these people don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
This is an ideology. lashing out at somebody with that kind of statement, it's
Right.
kind of a mild statement, but still, lashing out at somebody like that instead of addressing their concerns shows me that you are not confident in your own position. It shows me that your
Exactly.
position is purely ideological and you view it as a personal affront that somebody would question it.
Well, it also shows you that, because it used to be that scientists they would get really excited about any new discovery, even if it proved their hypothesis wrong, even if it completely invalidated their entire career's work, they still got excited about it because it was something new. And they realized that they were wrong, but it's a good thing that they realized they were wrong because now they can explore this new thing. And now it's like, if you question scientists at all, it's a crime. And they've lost their passion for discovery and the natural world and figuring out how the natural world works, because they've reached like peak arrogance where somehow they already know everything that there is to know about our world,
Right.
and
Their
they
position-
can't be questioned.
They can't have even an imagination to think about how they might be wrong.
That's the crazy part, right? So our founding scientists used to be creative types. They weren't just procedural people. If you look at Da Vinci, he was an artist. He was ambidextrous. He was an engineer. He was a scientist. He carried a notebook around with him everywhere he went because he was observing the natural world and human behavior and all of these things. But he was a creative type. He was really interested in music. He was really interested in ritual and religion. He wrote about it extensively. And that's the most obvious one. But even Michelangelo, he dabbled in engineering and science and these things, even though he was primarily an artist. But it used to be that scientists were the most curious of people, and by nature were creative types. Now you get these people that are very type A, very OCD, very by the book, and they have no creative bone in their body. They cannot think outside the box. They have no imagination. They probably don't dream. You know, it's
They
like
regurgitate whatever the books have told them.
Exactly.
Whatever
and it's
their
like,
professors have told
I
them.
don't think you should be allowed to be a scientist if you cannot come up with a creative new idea or even ask a creative question that nobody else
Well,
has
here's
asked.
the thing. There's a reason why we think of scientists as like being academic and in lab coats and stuff and doing studies in some lab in some university somewhere.
Mm.
But the scientists that are making the most impact are in the private sphere.
True.
Elon Musk is a scientist.
Yes, and he's a good one too.
He basically invented reusable space rockets.
It's just so cool.
Right.
It's so cool.
And not only is he doing that, he's actually developing more efficient rocket engines
yes,
so
that's
that they
true.
can lower the amount of fuel that they need to use, so that way they can reduce the weight,
Yes.
which makes everything easier. So he is a scientist. Him and his team at Tesla are scientists, and they're creating billions of dollars of value in the world. Those are scientists. And how does Elon Musk become a scientist that does that? He goes, I wonder if I can use existing rocket technology to make a reusable rocket.
Exactly. And he's like, well, how do we reconfigure these different materials to make that happen?
Right.
Because he's exploring and he's willing to put up the capital to explore. It's called experimentation, and it's like no scientist experiments anymore. They play it so safe. Like, you're using a freaking model to do an experiment. How about you try something hands-on instead
Right.
of pressing enter?
Right. Yeah, and I think another good example of this too is that the Wright brothers, they
Yes.
wanted to have man-made flight, and they were roundly ridiculed from all kinds of people that human flight's impossible. You're never going to be able to build a
Yeah,
flying
that's
machine
true.
because it's just not possible. And they did it anyway.
Yeah.
Those guys are real scientists. They were doing practical hands-on experiments because they believed something was true, even when other people were mocking them for believing it was true.
But they also had an innate creative curiosity, right?
Right.
Because even if it didn't work, they were willing to see that through. And they were willing to try everything possible and everything they could think of, every adjustment they could make. And at the end of the day, if it had never worked, who knows if they would have kept trying? Who knows if they would have given up and just said, okay, it's impossible. We tried everything that physics can offer us. We've tried everything that our materials can offer us. But they didn't stop, even when it was difficult.
Right.
You know, they got closer to their end goal, but by tiny amounts. It wasn't like they just built a plane. It was like there's a lot of prototypes. There's a lot of error. There's also a lot of minor adjustments you have to do to your experiments too. Because maybe it flies, but it really veers the one way. Or maybe you can only get so much lift. And so you have to experiment with how you get more lift and how you get it to fly straight
It's
and how you do all these things.
Engineering is you might have a really complex task that you want to accomplish. And then the ultimate, at the end of the day, engineering is about solving the next problem.
It's
That's all it is.
fine-tuning. It's troubleshooting and it's fine-tuning.
Right. You solve one problem at a time, and then eventually you've solved so many problems that they stack up to create something bigger.
Well, and a lot of times you'll solve a problem just to realize that you've created another problem while you solve that problem. So there's a lot of fine-tuning that goes into it. But if you're a climate change scientist who presses a button to show a model.
And how do you validate your findings?
You can't.
If you're projecting into the future,
they're fact-checking the future.
Right. If you project, if your whole job is to create a climate model, you literally cannot validate that your model, which is a hypothesis, is correct.
Exactly.
You cannot validate that until 10 years or 15 years goes by. And then what? You're going to be old and wrong?
Which is why they keep changing it, like, oh, in 12 years we're going to have a problem. Oh, in 10 years we're going to have a problem. Oh, in 20 years we're going to have a problem. Because they get to that next goalpost or checkpoint or whatever, and they realize, oh, shit, the climate's okay.
Right. Well,
and they have to change it again.
And because they're taking so long, some people are going to spend their entire career doing this. They're never going to let it go. If they ever find out that they're wrong, they won't let it go. That's a human flaw.
Yes.
You spend 30 years working on something that ultimately ends up being a nothing burger. Guess what? You're not going to give that up.
Right.
You're going to keep it up as long as you possibly can, because otherwise your 30 years of life will have been a waste, which is what you're doing, Michael E. Mann. You're wasting your life.
Also, these checkpoints should be an obvious indication that these models don't work.
Yeah.
Because if you have to keep saying like 10 years, 12 years, whatever, I mean, it's a subversion, so it doesn't really matter what I'm saying. But if you have to keep moving that post, that is just proof that these models are trash and show you nothing.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's continue.
I think that's the last one.
Is that the last one?
Yeah. I think we pretty much exhausted that story, but I have a...
I thought maybe I had one more screenshot. But yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. Jordan Peterson is an international treasure and should be treated as such. Oh, is this it? Okay. So yes, I think this is the last one, but Zeke Housefather, a research scientist at Berkeley Earth, which sounds gross, tweeted graph showing how accurate scientists' projections of global warming have been over several decades. I didn't click on the link because I don't care. And he's quoted as saying, "For what it's worth, we've been projecting future warming since the first climate models in the late 1960s, early 1970s. We can look back to see how well they have performed. It turns out our models generally did a good job."
Oh, there's a weasel word, generally.
And also, if you're only looking at warming, like, we're coming out of an ice age. We've known this for a while.
Right. Yeah. And so here's the problem too: is
a general trend of upward.
Yeah. If you can prove a general trend of increased warming, that doesn't mean that your claims about what's causing the warming are correct. That's just.
It's so Weasley. It's like, yeah, the average temperature is going up every year. It's like, but why?
Right.
Tell me why.
And also, he uses the word generally, so obviously I don't know if that's a really small margin of error or a really wide margin of error. Like if your range is, we're going to guess the Earth is going to warm anywhere between 1 to 3 degrees in the next 100 years. Well, that's a huge range. I could guess that without a model.
It's a huge year range for a tiny temperature range.
Right.
It's like,
so it's like, it's almost,
probably.
It depends on how you set the parameters for success, right?
Right.
Because if your parameters for success are anywhere between 1 and 3 degrees over 100 years, you're bound to be correct in some way. Right?
At some point, probably, yeah.
Like, is it even possible for the Earth to warm more than 3 degrees in 100 years? Is that even possible, like, mechanically?
Yeah.
Unless you bombarded it with meteors. Like, what are the parameters for success? What do you mean by generally? And also, who cares?
If I had to guess, the graph that he tweeted is just like a sloping line upward that tells you absolutely nothing.
Also, isn't this a little bit of the gambler's fallacy? Like, being correct previously means that you'll be correct in the future?
True.
Like, this is the gambler's fallacy, right? Like, I'm on a winning streak, so therefore I'm more likely to win the next time.
Right.
No. There's nothing saying that the Earth isn't just going to, the temperature's going to plummet like a stone in, like, the next 10 years. Do you know that? I mean, it's probably unlikely.
Because it's not... The future is not dependent on the past necessarily.
Right. Necessarily. I mean, there's cause and effect.
There's a lot of things that the Earth could come into contact with.
Yeah, there's cause and effect, but
yeah.
when you're dealing with a hugely complex system, like there's millions or billions of causes and effects happening, and it's like
we could have a mass extinction event.
Yeah,
and that would just throw all the models in the trash can. But
yes, it would. So
yeah,
models are just generally not trustworthy. I think
I will always back my boy JP.
Yeah, and even when he's wrong, he's very thoughtful. He's not
but
wrong
he
often.
also he is not wrong often, but when he is very humble about it, and he's like, I think you're right, and I'm gonna have to think about that more.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one pretty I guess you would say famous example of that, where he just kind of goes, huh, I hadn't thought about that. Or I hadn't considered that.
Yeah, he was doing an interview with Jim Jeffries, the comedian.
Yeah.
And it was, I think it was around gay marriage or something.
I think that's
And Jim
right.
Jeffries asked him a question, and he was like, yeah, maybe I'm wrong. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, and that was the end of the conversation. And he admitted that he was probably wrong.
Yeah.
And then he hadn't thought about that specific point of the problem. And he said he would think about it.
Yep.
Well, that's all you can do.
So I wanna talk about COVID tangentially. We're not going to be getting into the weeds, but we're going to more talk about the cultural effects of COVID.
Maybe we won't get a tag on our video this time.
Oh, did we get one last time?
Almost all of our videos have the
COVID
CDC tag.
Okay, well that's fine. But so I'm just going to show this really quick. So
Okay.
this is a tweet from Tom Bevan.
Who the hell is that?
I don't know, but he gets retweeted a lot by people that I follow on Twitter, so that's good enough for me. But what it says is mass formation psychosis. 68% of those who are triple vaxxed are somewhat or very worried about getting sick from COVID. So and then he links this graph, and this graph basically shows exactly what he just said. So people that are triple vaxxed, 68% of them have some level of concern about getting COVID, either very or somewhat worried. Unvaccinated people.
Of just getting sick.
Right.
Not even of like hospitalization or dying.
Right.
Okay.
And look at this. So unvaccinated, only, what is that? 39% of unvaccinated people are even concerned a little bit about getting COVID. And over 50%, 53, whatever that number is, 53% of unvaccinated people are not concerned whatsoever. Well, the breakdown is not too concerned, 29%, and not at all concerned, 27%. So you have
basically we're winning.
A quarter of unvaccinated people are not concerned at all, and a quarter of unvaccinated people are not too concerned.
Yeah.
I would put myself in the not too concerned. I mean, I had contingency plans in place for if I got sick because I don't want to be stupid about it. But I also was just like, I'm going to get it someday.
I would put myself in the not concerned at all just because I don't have underlying health conditions that would have made it a fateful illness for myself. And I actually did have it, and I'm still not worried about it at all.
Right.
So
I just wanted to use that as like a context for this next article that I'm going into. So you obviously have triple boosted people that are far more like neurotic about this than unvaccinated people, which is a testament to what this article is saying.
Which makes sense.
Yes.
It makes sense.
Yes.
Because anybody who's wary about diseases in general is probably going to fall in the category of triple vax.
And anyone that's bought into the fear-mongering is going to be worried.
That's true, too.
So this New York Times article says America has split and it's now in, quote, very dangerous territory. So this is a dive into the depths of the New York Times, of course. This is by Thomas B. Edsall.
Sure.
I took screenshots here, so we'll go to the first one. So basically, everyone knows that there's a divide in the United States in terms of culture. And I think it's mostly, most people have pointed out that it's a class divide. There's the laptop class and then there's the rest of us.
What does that mean?
The laptop class are the people that can support lockdowns because their jobs don't depend on it.
Oh.
Because they can just log on to Zoom and have their meetings.
Hey, screw you guys.
I'm one of you. So this article says... So this portion of the article says, the United States continues to stand out among nations experiencing detrimental effects of polarization, according to what happens when democracies become perniciously polarized. A Carnegie Endowment for International Peace report. Oh, man.
That is a mouthful of a report.
The reason I want to talk about this article is because it's so insufferable the entire way through.
Okay.
The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Who the fuck in their right mind is listening to anything these people say? They're nobodies. I don't even know what they do, and I can already tell they're nobodies.
They're just a lot of rich bitches who have nothing better to do
Right.
with their time.
They're a bunch of Yale graduates that like to write a bunch of feel-good papers together that no one except the UN pays attention to, probably.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's so frustrating.
It's stupid.
But this is written by Jennifer McCoy of Georgia State and Benjamin Press of the Carnegie Endowment. And it says, quote, "The United States is quite alone among the ranks of perniciously polarized democracies in terms of its wealth and democratic experience. Of the episodes since 1950 where democracy is polarized, all of those, aside from the United States, involved less wealthy, less long-standing democracies, many of which have democratized recently. None of the wealthy, consolidated democracies of East Asia, Oceania, or Western Europe, for example, have faced similar levels of polarization for such an extended period." Now, I want to, first of all, point out that I don't understand why they're making this out to be some sort of unique thing. The United States has always been polarized. Always. Since the beginning. Since the beginning, the revolution, half of the nation were loyalists. They wanted to stay with the
More
British.
than half.
Right. They wanted to stay with the British Empire.
More than
Even
half.
after that,
Yeah.
you had Shays' Rebellion, which was
Yeah.
a rebellion against the United States government a few decades after the or I think it was 10 or 20 years after the Constitution was ratified.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you had senators getting caned on the Senate floor in the 1830s.
Right.
Like a guy almost got caned to death on the floor of the Senate.
Oh, that's right.
And then you had the Civil War.
Right.
And then you had the Jim Crow era. And there's probably dozens more.
But even just the way our government is structured, it's partisan.
Right.
It's a two-party system.
Yeah.
Which breeds division inherently
Yes.
because you have to pick a team. Like, you have to pick a side. And it was, the party names were different for a really long time. You know, it was the Federalists and the Democrats, I think, right?
Yeah,
Wasn't it? It was like,
then there was like the Democrat Republicans, and then you had the Whig
oh, that's
Party.
what it was. It was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans.
Yeah,
And then the Whig Party came, I think, as a backlash to the Democratic Republicans, right? Because they were kind of in the same vein, but they didn't really like where that party was going.
Yeah.
So then it was like the Whigs. Then it was like kind of a triple party system, but it didn't last very long. And so
then
it's
you
like,
had the progressives after the Civil
Yeah.
War, which was like, I think Teddy Roosevelt was the most famous progressive
Yeah.
candidate or something like that. I
but
might
the
be wrong
point
on that.
is that divisions are what have basically fueled this nation. Like
Right.
the discourse and the debate is what has led us to our big decisions
And
as a nation.
And I think the reason why we've always experienced division, they're making it out to be like the somehow unique thing.
Yeah.
The reason why we've always experienced division is because the minority opinion in this country has a huge amount of power. The Senate
Yes.
is not a majoritarian institution. It's a majoritarian when you consider the states being the unit of representation. But in terms of how many people the senators represent underneath that, it's not a democratic institution at all. It's designed to give minorities, aka small states, a huge amount of power in the federal government. And so I think that's where the division comes from, because you could have 60% of the American public that wants something and the other 40% are blocking it.
Right.
And it's like, what
But
do you...
it's designed to be that way because a 60-40 split is not a big enough split to justify decision making, right? Because you're going to have still a very large amount of your population that's unhappy with whatever's decided.
Right.
So they set it up deliberately that way. No matter how angry it makes people on either side, it's intentionally set up that way to protect the people
Right.
from decisions being made that they don't want made.
And that caused problems. Like
And it still causes problems.
It's one of the reasons why the Civil War was such a big thing, because it kept getting kicked down the road,
Right.
because there could never be a majority about getting rid of slavery. And
Mm-hmm.
so ultimately it ended up in a war.
Right. I
so-
mean, they tried. I mean, there was the 3/5 compromise, which was
Terrible.
disgusting, a disgusting abomination of a rule. But there were things that they were trying to do because of the natural division of our government. You know,
Yeah. And
they
it's-
were literally trying to compromise by devaluing humans. But disgusting.
So this article goes on to say that, let's see, it says McCoy and Press analyze the international pattern of polarization. What is with the alliteration here? And again, the United States stands out with by far the highest current level of polarization compared with other countries and regions, as the accompanying graph shows. So this goes to our model discussion.
Ugh.
How do they measure polarization? I'm going to ask you this question. How do you think they measure polarization?
I'm guessing they're basing it on race. And so all of the other countries that they're comparing it to are homogenous countries. Am I close?
Well, they do bring race as a factor into this later,
Of course
but
they do.
I'm just more concerned about how do you quantify polarization? How do you put a number to polarization and then
So,
graph it? Like this graph might as well just be like they grabbed one of their children and said, "Here, son, scribble on this piece of paper."
I'm guessing how they measure it is by like self-reporting surveys. Like you go up to people on the street and ask them if they think the country is polarized or whatever.
But they would have to have been doing that since 1980 because that's when this graph starts. So if you want to tell me that they've been doing this for 40 years, then maybe.
Maybe, are they going based off of like legislation that's been passed?
I don't know.
And they don't ever explain how they create this graph.
I never saw anywhere where it says. So it says
then I'm going to stop speculating.
So it says at the bottom, note, polarization ratings are aggregated among countries by region, with not all regions shown. A rating of 0 indicates that opposing political groups tend to interact in a friendly manner, ranging to a rating of 4 that indicates that they tend to be hostile. But what does that mean? Those are subjective terms.
What's friendly and what's hostile, and how are you assigning the ratings? Like, this is a very, I forgot the word, but it's inaccurate to say the least, but it's also, it's not, they're trying to turn a qualitative study or even a case study into a quantitative study, and you can't do that.
Right.
If there is no way to track actual numbers, you can't claim it's quantitative. You have to make it qualitative. So the fact that they've tried to put numbers on this chart is ridiculous. They really should have done it more like how the COVID vaccine feeling chart was laid out, like the very somewhat not at all
right
or kind of thing. That's how this should have been laid out. It should have been qualitative, not quantitative, because it's so subjective, and you cannot put numbers on friendly and hostile.
Right.
It's not possible.
I don't. This just seems like they're playing magic games with the numbers and then getting something that looks interesting. And it's like, I don't...
Ooh, look at the pretty lines.
Right. Why should I trust your numbers? I literally cannot think of a reasonable way to quantify something like polarization. I cannot think of that.
Honestly, the only thing that you can actually quantify polarization with is like magnetism and binary.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
No.
Like, those are literally the only things you can actually say are polarized, and you can quantify it.
Yeah, I don't. Anyway, so this goes on.
I'm just saying.
The authors point to a number of causes, including the durability of identity politics in a racially and ethnically diverse democracy. As the authors note, the United States is perhaps alone in experiencing a demographic shift that poses a threat to the white population that has historically been the dominant group in all arenas of power, allowing political leaders to exploit insecurities surrounding this loss of status. And there it is. They blame the polarization on the white people being scared that the brown people are coming to replace them. This gives me even less faith in their polarization numbers, that they just say, oh, well, the reason that the United States is more polarized than other places is because white people are losing their power. What? How can that be?
Why do you want identity politics to be durable?
No, they're saying durability of identity politics because of the nature of the multiracial society we have. Identity politics are durable as it's a descriptive word. It just says that they're
as a result of our melting pot, basically.
It's just a long-standing feature of American politics.
So I was right. They're trying to compare a very racially diverse nation to homogenous nations.
And then they're
which
using...
already disqualifies your claim to polarization.
And they're using the racially diverse category to say, well, that's what's contributing to the polarization. So it's like they're doing the analysis wrong in two ways. It looks like.
I hate these people.
So then it goes on to say, I just want to read this quote because it doesn't mean anything, but I'll just read the whole thing. In Polarization Under Rising Inequality and Economic Decline, Stewart, McCarty, and Bryson argue that economic scarcity acts as a strong disincentive to cooperate relations between disparate racial and ethnic groups, in large part because such cooperation may produce more benefits but at higher risk. And here comes the gobbledygook. Interactions with more diverse outgroup members pool greater knowledge applicable to a wider variety of situations. These interactions, when successful, generate better solutions and greater benefits. However, we also assume that the risk of failure is higher for outgroup interactions because of a weaker capacity to coordinate among individuals compared to more familiar in-group interactions. Does that mean anything to you?
I mean, kind of, like, they got it right, but I think the analysis that they're trying to spin on it is wrong. Because you always have an in-group preference, right? Like, that is true.
Yeah.
So, of course, it's going to be more difficult to cooperate when you're interacting with people out of your group. Just inherently, biologically, it is so.
Yes.
Not in a civilized society, it shouldn't be difficult to interact with people out of group, right? But maybe your ability to trust them is lessened, or it just takes longer to trust them because of your in-group preference.
But in-group doesn't have to be necessarily racial, though.
No, it doesn't. It can be class. It can be education. It can be age.
So
age is a big one. It can be ability or disability. I mean, it can be anything, right? So,
right.
But they are trying to make it into a racial thing by not saying that specifically.
Right.
So it's tricky.
So, yeah, it is true that you're more likely to be more successful with people that share your interests. I mean, that's basically what they're saying, I think. You're more likely to share knowledge and to be successful and have economic opportunities, generate better solutions, greater benefits.
They're just saying that if you interact with a broader range of people, you can come up with more solutions that might be better because maybe, because everybody's going to bring something different to the table that can help to formulate a good solution to, I don't know what kind of problem they're trying to propose here, but it's not necessarily that so they're trying to make the claim that, like, just because if you want to interact with only your in-group preference, those solutions that you come up with might not be as good as those that you come up with multiple people that are out of your group.
So they wrote an entire paragraph to say that, hey, the more opinions you can get on something, the better off you'll be.
Pretty much. But they're trying to make it into a racial thing.
Right. So that's the problem. Like, they said nothing.
They could have said what you just said instead of an entire paragraph.
Cooperating with more people with more diverse backgrounds and intellects and interests is better for you. Thanks for pointing out the obvious.
I feel like I just went back to kindergarten.
Sharing is caring.
Like, cooperation is helpful.
Yeah. That's what they basically said, right?
That's basic. Yeah. They could have just gotten a preschool teacher to come in and say, sharing is caring. Treat your neighbor as you want to be treated.
Right.
Boom. Done.
But they're trying to say, because of the in-group and out-group and racial differences, that there's economic scarcity or whatever. And it's like,
I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think it's just, who can you trust?
Yeah.
Who has any credibility in whatever problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah.
Who comes up with the best idea? I don't think it matters who they are. It's just whoever has the best idea. I
don't know what the credentials of these people are, but it doesn't
matter. It doesn't matter.
No, but what I'm saying, it doesn't matter. They're not making any sense. They're just writing stuff.
If they have credentials, they need to be taken away because they're not smarter than a preschooler.
No, it doesn't matter. Like, they have credentials that are useless. They don't even need to be taken away. They just need to be recognized as useless. If you're writing a book that basically has this paragraph that says, hey, cooperating with more people is better, what use are you? And you're not even, I don't see any studies cited. They're coming up with numbers for polarization out of who knows where. They're just
making it up.
We have a problem, I think, broadly with over-intellectualizing everything. You are making some things more complicated than they should be.
Yeah.
You are literally taking obvious facts, if we're understanding this paragraph correctly, writing it into a way that's exceedingly hard to parse, and then sharing it with your fellows at the Carnegie International Peace Institute or whatever the frink you're talking about. Like,
when you can literally simplify it down to something you teach your 5-year-old, which is just treat people well.
Yeah. These people are...
And that cooperation is key. Like, these are literal talking points you teach 4 and 5-year-olds. But you're right. They're trying to over-intellectualize it because you know what they're doing? They're trying to justify whatever credential that they have. Mm-hmm. They're trying to justify however many thousands of dollars they spent to get said credential, but they're not actually that intelligent. And they can't come up with an original idea. So they have to make everything sound very fruity and then publish it and then share it with the fellows, like you said, and then pat each other on the back and say, oh, you did a very good job. That was very insightful. That was great. And it's like,
And then they go to their cocktail
no,
parties.
a 4-year-old who is living in the projects can tell you the exact same thing, but in an easier way to understand.
Yep.
Give that kid a PhD.
Yeah, and then there's just one more piece that I want to talk about here. So it says the three authors argue that there are a number of consequences of the ideological nationalization of the United States party system. For one, it has limited the two parties' abilities to tailor their positions to local conditions. Moreover, it has led to greater geographic concentration of the parties' respective support coalitions. So I'm not going to read what they quoted exactly. That will be sufficient, but that's just factually wrong. That is wrong on its face. I can prove to you that this is wrong. So they said it has limited the two parties' abilities to tailor their positions to local conditions. Really? Then explain to me how Joe Manchin and AOC are in the same party.
Exactly.
How,
Exactly.
do you think AOC would win in West Virginia? Because
No.
Because it doesn't seem like it.
No.
And if she can't win in West Virginia and they're both occupying the same party, then guess what? They can tailor their positions to the local conditions.
Exactly.
Can't they? Joe Manchin is never going to vote to get rid of coal. Why? Because West Virginia produces a lot of coal. AOC would vote to get rid of coal in a heartbeat.
Well, I think the other problem, too, is that they seem to be forgetting that local governments also run on a two-party system.
Yeah, that's true.
So on like a macro level, they're saying that localization isn't possible because they forget that representatives are supposed to be representative of their area.
Right.
But also, if you're just talking about like even mayoral candidates, they still run on a two-party system. You're going to have Democratic mayors and you're going to have Republican mayors or conservative mayors. And whatever the culture is of that city is going to vote based on the culture and what they want in a mayor.
Right.
So actually it doesn't affect local tailoring at all.
Yeah.
It actually has been functioning. I think it functions better on a local level to have a two-party system because it's smaller and it's more community-based.
Right.
It's not about these bigger issues and the bigger bills and federal problems, right? So having a two-party system in a local area is actually better because you can say, these are our values as a culture, as a city, and we're going to pick the candidate for mayor that best aligns with that, regardless of which party they're in. But if we have a culture of more progressiveness, we're probably going to pick a Democratic candidate. And if you have a more rural, blue-collar culture, you're probably going to pick a more conservative candidate.
Yeah.
And that is the local level. So
yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more broadly, too, about the two-party system because that seems to be both for midwits and supposedly intellectual people. It seems to be like a target. Like the blame for polarization is laid squarely at the feet of the two-party system by a lot of people. And I just think that that's flat out wrong. And the Joe Manchin AOC example is perfect. But
I do like
also,
that example.
we have primaries. You know,
Yes.
Donald Trump ran against, I think, 23 other Republican candidates. All of them were different. Donald Trump told Jeb Bush to his face that his brother lied to get us into a war. And they're ostensibly in the same party.
Yeah.
So you have a primary that selects among 24 ideologically diverse candidates. You ultimately end up picking Trump, who is a vast departure from the old Republican Party.
Right.
He wins, and now the Republican Party has been changed. This idea that the two-party system is like, oh, if you pick a Democrat, you're always going to get the same ideological beliefs, and if you pick a Republican, you're always going to get the same ideological beliefs. I think that's a wrong analysis. Because you have people like Donald Trump and Mitt Romney who are in the same party couldn't be more different from each other. You have someone like Thomas Massey, who is in the Republican Party, libertarian, much different than Chris Christie, who is much more of this big government authoritarian kind of style, strongman style. So it's like, this is just, I think it's a cop-out to say, well, the polarization is caused by the two-party system. People don't have choice. You have choice. You have choice in the primary.
Right.
You have choice in the general. You can vote for a different type of Republican if you want. Then you have, Republicans coming out of the South are going to be much different than the Republicans coming out of the North just because their experiences are different.
Right.
So it's like, there's so many variables to what kind of person you're getting that their party affiliation almost doesn't matter. It kind of gives you a broad scale idea of generally what positions they're going to take. But you even have some Republicans that are squeamish on the idea of saying that abortion's bad.
Right.
So it's like, what? Two-party system doesn't have anything to do with the polarization, I don't think, or very minimal.
I think they're trying to make the two-party system the source of the problem of polarization, but it isn't, because politics is a spectrum. There is the political spectrum, right? So you're going to fall anywhere on that line. You know, you might have, like you said, you might have tendencies that align more with one party than the other, but then you also get libertarians who are square in the middle.
Right.
So it just really depends, but they're trying to create a problem out of something that isn't a problem at the moment.
Right.
But you have to wonder why. You know, you have to question their motivations.
Well, I think it simply boils down to the over-intellectualization, because we all know that the United States is polarized right now. But I think you can make an argument that it's always been polarized, at least at multiple moments of history. And, you know, we could say we're polarized just because we have different views about where the culture should go and all that. You could come up with a very normal, average person sort of explanation. But then when a bunch of people who have nothing better to do than to justify their jobs by writing long, dry books, they're going to over-intellectualize it and try to connect dots that can't be connected. And they're going to try to formalize their findings by making up graphs that show some sort of interesting pattern, when it's just like, you're over analyzing it. You're applying your intellect in the wrong area. You need to take a step back, just accept that people are always going to be different, that our society is designed to have minority power, which is why you're going to get a lot of polarization, because the majority can't just steamroll everything that it wants. And that's our system. It has always been here, the polarization, and it's always going to be here.
Well, and I think the polarization that we're facing in our country right now isn't driven by our political systems. I think it is purely societal, which, yes, politics and society go hand in hand, but I think it's primarily societal. I don't know that it has a lot to do with politics, because for many decades, our system has functioned the same way. Like, only recently are the party definitions kind of starting to change, but that was because of Trump. But for a really long time, it was the status quo. Like, you knew what you were getting in a Democrat, and you knew what you were getting in a Republican, and there was probably still polarization in the nation, but I don't think it had anything to do with the political system. Polarization in this country has always come from society, and the point of government is to try to enact policies that mitigate that societal polarization. But it's not a result of the government.
Right.
It's just a result of culture clashing,
right,
which comes from immigrants, but it also comes from every state individually has its own culture. And even cities within states have their own culture. Our nation is just so large that cultures and subcultures form very rapidly and are long lasting a lot of times. So I think polarization is just bound to happen when you have a nation this large, and we don't have a long-standing history that we can all collectively come back to in cases of European nations, you know, like especially in Germany, they have Oktoberfest, and they have their traditional wear that they all put on, you know, and that's a collective thing that they share. But because of the way that our nation was founded, because of the way our nation has developed, we don't have things like that. So our cultural differences are always going to drive our polarization.
Right. And our cultural differences are a feature of America. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that the United States is the most innovative region of the world.
Exactly.
And it's because you have all these cultures clashing. You know, like hip hop was originally, you know, a creation of Black Americans from a long history of Black music before that.
Right.
But now you have people like Eminem who adopt that culture and become really successful at it.
But I think, to add to your point, it is a feature, not a bug. And going off the music thing, something that a lot of people don't know is that salsa, the genre salsa, is actually an American-made genre.
Oh, really?
Yes. So what happened was Cubans immigrated to New York, and they fused their traditional music with the new jazz scene that was coming up in New York. And they created salsa, and it was actually a street genre. And when I learned about that in my music history classes, I was so blown away because I thought it was just something they had brought with them.
Right.
But it was their way of becoming Americans. It was immigrant Cubans' way of saying, we're Americans now. This is a piece of us, but this is a new thing.
Right.
So it was street music, but it is actually an American genre, which is so cool to think about.
But you have to, that's really cool, but you also have to imagine that when new things like that come about, there are going to be a certain percentage of people that are just like, what is this?
Exactly.
Well, you know, I mean, you have this, like the traditional, like old person, like listening to the new kids music.
Exactly.
And like, what is this? Right.
Well,
and
thankfully salsa is very like catchy and
right.
things
But
like
you
that,
have to
but
imagine
still.
even at that point in New York, there would have been some people like, what is this garbage that you're bringing to
True,
America?
true,
There had
yeah.
to be some people like
Yeah.
that. Right. And, you know,
Well, and
things,
techno music was the same way. Techno music started out as a black genre.
okay. Well, anyway,
Interestingly, but yeah.
that's a friction point though.
Yes.
When you're introducing something new into quote unquote existing culture, there's going to be friction. There's going to be some amount of rejection to that. When you stack up a ton of new stuff and you throw it at a culture all at once,
Sure.
you're going to be in a constant state of like, what is this new stuff? Oh, this is kind of cool. Ew, that's gross. I don't like where our culture's going. That's always going to be the tension.
Right.
You compare that to something like Germany, which has its long-standing ancient traditions
Exactly.
that are very rigid. No one's doing any innovation on Oktoberfest.
No, that's true.
The Americans have
Yeah.
adopted Oktoberfest to some extent and,
Yeah.
and
I mean,
turned it into
they have their traditional drink, they have their traditional dress, they have the traditional foods they eat during Oktoberfest, they have their traditional rituals that they perform during Oktoberfest, and it doesn't change.
it's very rigid. And
Does
you're
not
dealing,
change.
so you're dealing with a culturally homogenous,
Yeah.
rigid, they all share the same cultures, racially homogenous,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm sure plays a factor. Just because of the different experiences of people growing up
Right.
in different situations. And it's just, yeah, you're going to have a less polarized society when everyone thinks the same.
But it's also kind of boring, right? Because if you're never introduced to new ideas, you're never challenged. Because I think at some point everyone is going to experience polarization on a personal level, because you're going to meet people that you just vehemently disagree with. Like, you just are never going to agree.
Right.
But at the very least, that person is making you think, and they're going to make you think about what you believe, and they're going to make you question why you believe it, or at least they should. Because if you meet somebody that you absolutely disagree with, you need to be asking yourself, why do I disagree with this person? Are my ideas correct, or do I need to reevaluate? And if you do change your ideas or your values adjust a little bit because of that interaction, you probably will never admit it to that person, but you probably also will never interact with that person again. But polarization can actually act as a catalyst to change.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's for the better, sometimes it's for the worse. But if it's a way that opens your mind to something new that you hadn't considered before, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, so many times we think that contention and adversity are net negatives, but I don't think that they always are.
Yeah.
Because without polarization, without contention, you would never be challenged, and you would never end up with a new breakthrough that might lead to a better solution.
Right. Yeah. And I think, what you said about all of that cultural contention, that has to remain squarely in the cultural sphere, I think.
Yes.
I think elevating adversity, polarization from the culture into the realm of politics, that's when you start cementing power and making bad decisions. Like, there's no reason why anything related to trans issues has to elevate to the level of the government.
And it shouldn't.
That's a fight that we can have purely in the social sphere. That doesn't need to be anywhere near the governing structures of the United States. And I guess that's my worry, is like, I'm okay with the polarization existing in the cultural sphere. You have the parallel economy developing. Dan Bongino was just banned off of YouTube permanently, which just means that his followers are going to go to Rumble and watch him there.
But
or on
he
Fox
was also
News.
banned after he already said he was leaving YouTube permanently.
Well,
so,
anyway, but I'm saying,
But
like,
yes.
the parallel economy is already there.
Yeah.
And so we can fight these battles in the social sphere. Conservatives are going to follow the people they like, regardless of what platforms they get kicked off of. And the liberals are going to keep their New York Times and their YouTube, and they're going to try to cleanse Spotify. There's no reason whatsoever any of those cultural fights need to be elevated to the government.
Well, and I think
At all.
it's dangerous to elevate it to the government too, because I know we said that, like, the party systems have evolved and have changed, but the underlying structure of the government hasn't. Just because party names change and party values change doesn't mean that the structure itself changes, right? Like, we really haven't had any change to any branch of government since their conception.
Yeah,
Not really.
No structural change, yeah.
So if we start integrating social issues into the political sphere, you run the risk of changing the entirety of the political structure. And it's set up to be the backbone of our nation so that even when things are going haywire societally, we still have the governmental structures to fall back on, and we can still go back to our roots, essentially, right? And put our trust in the legislative systems.
Yeah.
That's the goal. It's
Right.
supposed to be like your guiding star almost.
It's ideally supposed to be a neutral governing structure that everyone can agree with. That's ideally what your government would be.
Everyone can agree with and everyone can interact with.
Right.
But
that's the glue that binds us together, that it keeps the rules, the boundaries in place so that we can have these
Right.
fights in the social sphere in a civilized way.
yes, but we can't start blending them, because then we're going to be in trouble if we're trying to change the complete structure of how our government runs.
Right. And
That's gonna be a problem.
I think this is why conservatives are right to be cautious about the fact that, there are no people that share the conservative ideology at the top levels of government. Like,
Yeah.
Dr. Fauci's not a conservative. None of the people at the CDC are conservatives. They're the liberal laptop class
Yeah.
types sitting atop their ivory tower telling everyone what to do. And that would be fine if they didn't also have an enormous amount of power.
Right.
This is why they're losing trust, is because they are not being the neutral player that they should be. They're losing trust because they're very obviously placating one half of the United States and leaving the other half, like, infuriated and questioning, why did my business get shut down because of you? Why this? Why that? So it's starting to, these cultural issues are starting to seep into the government system. And I think that's when the polarization becomes dangerous, is when it starts to get into the power structures.
Yes. Well, the other problem with that too is that conservatives are the people that are not okay with this seeping of culture into government, but they also don't fight back hard enough. And the liberals and the progressives are the people that are okay with the melding and the combining of culture and government because it benefits them for the moment.
Right.
And they also tend to be the group that values security over freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Conservatives, at least they used to value freedom over security, because the idea is if you have freedom, you can provide security for yourself. But because liberals and progressives are the party that value security over freedom, that's why they're okay with this melding that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But once it happens, it's going to be damn near impossible to reverse that.
Right.
And so if we want to preserve what we have, conservatives need to start fighting on the offensive.
Right.
And not just on like the quasi defensive, because really they're not even defensive half the time. They're just kind of like, well, I guess this is okay, but this is where I draw the line. But then they push it again and they go, well, I guess this is okay, but this is where I draw the line. So,
and I think
that's a problem too.
Well, yeah, and I think this is probably what bothers me about like the super based conservatives, is because they're just the left wingers. They just want to impose their own worldview on everyone else. They want to do exactly what the left wingers do, except imposing a right wing ideology.
Yeah.
So they want to take over the institutions and then like force certain things to happen that the liberals aren't going to like. And I'm like, no, I want a Republican to go into office and just gut all of the institutions, gut the FBI, gut the CDC, gut the public health, do all that. Rob the government of its power to do anything that it's been able to do during the pandemic.
Exactly.
No lockdowns, no mask mandates, no vaccine mandates, certainly. Stop the FBI from doing domestic terror attacks. Gut all of this. Gut the CIA, gut the generals, make sure they're not starting foreign wars, and then make sure that it stays that way. That's what I want.
Yeah.
I don't want to impose my worldview on somebody else. I just want to remove the ability of them to impose it on me.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't like saying that I'm a conservative, because there is no institution that we have currently that I want to conserve.
Yeah.
Because I think all of them are corrupt. I think all of them have become rotten and diseased, and they just need to be wiped out, like you said. I think we would benefit as a nation if we went back to bare bones government, like how our nation started. Yes, it was tricky when we first started, and it was a little unstable, but I think the bare bones is the best way. I think if you focus more on small community, small government, that will benefit everybody. I think this push to emphasize federal government involvement in every aspect of Americans' lives is I don't want to say dangerous, but it doesn't lead to a good place. And it's also not necessary.
Right.
Like, that big of a government does not need to be involved in county affairs or city affairs.
Yeah.
It's just not necessary. There's a reason we have local governments. So the federal government doesn't have to have a hand in all of that.
Right. If New York State wants to lock down during the pandemic and Ohio doesn't, then
it's not my business.
Why does that have to be a federal issue?
Exactly.
Like, if the federal government wants to just fund studies to give the states the information that they need, and I'm okay with the federal government buying PPE and buying medical treatments and stuff. Stocking up
on
making
supplies.
that available to the states on an as needed basis. That's perfect. That's a perfect, like, a support role is a perfect role for the federal government to play. But in terms of what policies are set that actually affect the lives of the people, that ideally would be in the hands of the local and state governments.
Exactly.
That's where the power properly resides. And that's not a revelation. That's not, that's not me being brilliant. The 10th Amendment says that.
I was going to say, that was a deliberate intention of our government at its onset. So, yeah, I think we're heading in a very dangerous direction of giving over too much power to the federal government, and it needs to be reined in and taken away.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
We don't need an FBI. We don't need a CIA. We can probably get rid of those things. I think most federal agencies we can probably get rid of.
Yeah, Department of Education.
OSHA,
yeah.
CDC.
Yeah, there's no reason why states can't have their own individual OSHAs.
Exactly. Why can't you have your own CDC? Why can't your CDC be funded by, like, whatever is the best medical school in your state?
Well, the states do have their own public health institutions, but they get overridden. They get overridden by the federal level because those are the big boys.
Because if you have your own public health correspondent or agency in your state, and you have a public health crisis within your state, then you shouldn't have to consult the federal government about it.
Right.
They don't care about your state. They don't have any hand in it. Just consult your state public health agency.
Right.
Because it's a problem with your state, not the whole country.
Right. Anyway, I think that's going to do it for this episode of Take Your Medicine. Once again, I'm Jacob.
And I'm Sadie.
And be sure to follow us. All of our social links are in the description wherever you're watching or listening.
Yes. Please go forth. Enjoy your Friday night. Have a Tiber Peeber. In my honor.
Okay, in your honor.
Yeah.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.